A split second is all it takes to ruin a life, or save one. Tess Miller didn't mean to break the jaw of the city's most feared underworld boss. She just wanted the blood off her clean floor. What happened next wasn't a fairy tale, it was a trap. The smell of lemon-scented ammonia always lingered in the back of Tess's throat, a chemical burn that tasted like cheap rent and missed dinners. It was 4 a.m, the grand house on the hill, owned by a man whose name people only whispered in the city's coastal diners, was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Tess wrung out the mop. Her knuckles were raw, the skin split along the joints from the biting October cold and the relentless buckets of soapy water. She was 24, but her shoulders carried the permanent slump of someone who had spent a decade lifting things that were too heavy for her. She didn't look at the oil paintings on the walls or the crystal chandeliers that caught the weak moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. To her, those things weren't luxury. They were just more surfaces to dust. Thomas Dane was not a man who slept much. Tess knew this because she often found his empty crystal tumblers on the mahogany desk in the library, always smelling of expensive peat smoke and stale stress. She had seen him from a distance a dozen times, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette in tailored charcoal wool, surrounded by men who walked with their hands tucked inside their jackets. He wasn't handsome in the way the men on television were. His nose had been broken at least once, his jaw was permanently set like a rusted vise, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky over a polluted harbor. He looked like what he was, a wolf who had survived the traps. Tess was wiping down the baseboards in the long gallery when the front doors opened. It wasn't the usual low murmur of Thomas's return. There was a scuffle, a wet, heavy thud. She froze, her rag pressed against the white wood. Through the gap in the double doors, she saw them. Thomas was stumbling, his arms slung over the shoulder of a shorter, stouter man named Frank, whom Tess knew as one of the regular drivers. But Thomas wasn't drunk. The dark wool of his coat was soaked through with something blacker than water, sticking to his ribs in thick, heavy folds. The metallic tang of fresh blood immediately cut through the lemon bleach in the air. "In here," Frank hissed, kicking open the door to the small parlor right next to where Tess was kneeling. He didn't see her in the shadows of the unlit hallway. Thomas groaned, a low, animal sound that vibrated through the floorboards. "The harbor," he muttered, his voice gravelly, thick with pain. It was Arthur. He knew the route. "Don't talk, boss. Just sit." Frank hauled him toward a leather armchair. Tess should have stayed in the dark. She should have slipped out through the servants' staircase, gone back to her damp basement apartment, and pretended she had never seen the great Thomas Dane leaking onto his own expensive rugs. But her bucket was right there. If she moved, the plastic handle would clatter. If she stayed, she was a witness to something that usually got people buried in the marshlands. Then the back door of the gallery clicked. It was a soft sound, the faint scrape of leather against the marble threshold. Tess turned her head slowly. Another man was entering. It was Arthur, the young, sharp-faced guard who usually sat in the security booth at the gate. He wasn't looking for a towel or a doctor. He had a suppressed pistol in his right hand, held low against his thigh, his movements deliberate and silent. Frank was leaning over Thomas, trying to tear open the boss's shirt to get to the wound. Thomas's head was lolling back, his eyes half closed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Neither of them heard Arthur's quiet approach. Tess's stomach turned to ice. A strange, unwanted clarity washed over her. If Arthur fired that gun, he wouldn't leave the maid alive to talk to the police. Her survival wasn't separate from Thomas's. For the next 30 seconds, they were strapped into the same sinking boat. Arthur raised the gun, aiming at the back of Frank's head, intending to take out the loyal dog first. Tess didn't think about the chain of command, her low wages, or the 300 years of family history backing the criminal empire of the Dane family. She only saw the silver reflection of the gun barrel and the absolute certainty of her own death if she did nothing. She didn't scream. Screaming took breath, and she needed every drop of air. She lunged out of the shadow of the hallway just as Arthur stepped into the parlor doorway, But she didn't hit Arthur. He was too far, his gun already raised. Instead, she threw her entire weight into the parlor, aiming straight for Thomas Dane. Thomas, even semi-conscious and bleeding out, felt the sudden rush of air. He blinked, his instincts forcing his head to turn toward the intrusion. What he expected was a bullet or a blade. What he got was Tess's right fist, balled tight, driven by years of lifting heavy furniture, and the raw, unadulterated terror of a woman who refused to die in an apron. She caught him square on the point of his jaw. It wasn't a professional boxer's punch. It was a clumsy, heavy, desperate strike that carried all her weight. The force of the blow, combined with his state of shock, snapped Thomas's head back and sent his heavy frame toppling sideways out of the leather chair, crashing hard onto the parquet floor. Thwip. The suppressed gunshot spat into the room a millisecond later. The bullet tore through the leather headrest exactly where Thomas's temple had been resting a heartbeat before, sending a shower of horsehair stuffing into the air. Frank yelled, spinning around. Arthur, his rhythm broken by the sudden eruption of the Maid and the disappearance of his target, tried to realign his aim, but Frank was already drawing his own weapon. Two loud, unsuppressed shots echoed through the high ceilings of the estate, deafening in the enclosed space. Arthur crumpled into the doorway, his gun clattering across the floor, his eyes wide and blank as the dark stain spread across his chest. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder and Tess's frantic, ragged breathing. She was on her knees, her hand throbbing with a white-hot agony. She had never hit anyone before. She was fairly certain she had broken at least 2 of her own fingers. What the hell? Frank breathed, his gun still smoking as he looked from the dead man on the floor to the maid who was cradling her right hand against her ribs. On the floor, Thomas Dane let out a long, ragged curse. He rubbed his jaw, which was already beginning to swell into a dark, ugly purple. He looked up at Tess from the floor, his winter sky eyes sharp, lethal, and completely bewildered. The cellar of the Dane estate didn't smell like lemons. It smelled like damp limestone, old wine casks, and the dry, powdery dust of things forgotten for half a century. Tess sat on a wooden crate, her right hand wrapped in a cold, wet dish towel she had managed to grab before 2 of Thomas's guards had escorted her down here. They hadn't been gentle, but they hadn't broken anything else either. They had just treated her like a package that needed to be kept cool until the owner decided what to do with it. Her hand was twice its normal size. Every time her heart beat, a sharp needle of pain shot up her forearm. She sat in the dark, her teeth chattering, though she couldn't tell if it was from the cellar's chill or the lingering adrenaline that made her knees feel like water. She had punched Thomas Dane. The realization was a dull weight in her stomach. People died for looking at him wrong, and she had smashed his jaw like a drunkard in a tavern brawl. The heavy oak door at the top of the stone stairs groaned open. A sliver of yellow light cut through the gloom, followed by the steady, unhurried thud of leather-soled shoes. It wasn't the guards. The footsteps were too heavy, the rhythm too deliberate. Thomas Dane walked down the stairs alone. He had changed his clothes. The bloody wool coat was gone, replaced by a crisp white shirt, though the left sleeve was pinned back where a thick white bandage wrapped his shoulder. But it was his face that Tess looked at. The left side of his jaw was prominent, swollen, and stained in angry, mottled black and blue. A small cut on his lip had formed a dark scab. He stopped 3 feet from her. He didn't look like a man who had almost died an hour ago. He looked like an auditor checking a ledger. "You have a mean right hook, Teresa," he said. His voice was lower than usual, a bit thick on the left side where the swelling hindered his movement. "Tess," she whispered, her throat dry. "Nobody calls me Teresa." "Tess, then." He reached into his pocket with his good hand, pulled out a silver case, and extracted a cigarette. He lit it with a heavy gold lighter, the flare illuminating the sharp lines of his face, the dark bruise, and the cold calculation in his eyes. He blew the smoke upward, where it drifted into the low rafters. "Frank says if you hadn't moved when you did, I'd have a hole in my ear. Or worse, Arthur was going to shoot you, she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. And then he was going to shoot me. I didn't want to die over your business. Thomas took another drag. Grounded logic. Most people in this house would say they did it out of loyalty. They'd lie to make themselves look like saints. You did it because you didn't want your blood on the floor. I just finished scrubbing the gallery, she said, a flash of her usual exhaustion cutting through the fear. It takes 2 hours to get the wax right. I wasn't going to let some bastard ruin it. A small, genuine spark of amusement crossed Thomas's face, though it quickly dissolved into a grimace as the movement pulled at his bruised jaw. He touched the swelling with 2 fingers, wincing slightly. You broke my line of sight, Tess. You also nearly dislocated my jaw. My doctor had to pop it back into place before he stitched my shoulder. Tess looked down at her own towel-wrapped hand. I think I broke my fingers. Thomas looked at her hand. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco smoke, the sharp tang of antiseptic, and the faint, expensive scent of his cologne. He reached down, took her left wrist to steady her, and used his thumb to gently peel back the wet cloth from her right hand. His fingers were large, calloused, but surprisingly careful. He looked at the swollen purple knuckles. 2, he diagnosed quietly. The index and the middle. You didn't tuck your thumb, did you? I don't usually hit people, Mr. Dane. Clearly, he let go of her wrist, dropping the towel back into place. Arthur was with me for 4 years. His father worked for my father. I gave him a house, a car, and a percentage of the docks. And he sold me to the Marcone family for $50,000 and a promise of a promotion. He looked at her, his gaze heavy and unblinking. You make $80 a week to scrub my toilets, and you're the one who kept my head attached to my neck. I told you, Tess said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It wasn't for you. It doesn't matter who it was for, Thomas said. He tossed the cigarette butt onto the stone floor and crushed it with the heel of his shoe. In my world, intention is a luxury for dead men. Results are the only currency that matters. He turned and began to walk back up the stairs. Am I going to jail? Tess called out after him, her heart hammering against her ribs again. Or the river? Thomas stopped on the 3rd step. He didn't turn around, but the yellow light from above caught the hard edge of his profile. The river is full of people who failed me, Tess. You didn't fail. But you can't go back to the mop. A maid who punches the boss is a bad look for discipline. Then what happens to me? Get some sleep, he said, his voice echoing in the stone stairwell. The doctor will see to your hand in the morning. After that, your life gets expensive. The room they gave her on the 3rd floor wasn't a servant's quarters. It was a guest suite, the kind reserved for distant relatives or business associates who needed to be kept close. The sheets were white linen, cold to the touch, and the mattress was so soft it made Tess's back ache after years of sleeping on a saggy cot with a broken spring. Her right hand was encased in a hard splint, the skin underneath itching from the ointment the old, silent doctor had applied. He hadn't asked her any questions. He had just set the bones, taped them up, and left a bottle of small white pills on the nightstand. When she woke up on the 3rd afternoon, there was a new uniform resting on the armchair by the window. It wasn't the blue cotton scrub dress she had worn for 2 years. It was a high-necked, charcoal gray wool dress, perfectly tailored, with a stiff white collar. Next to it sat a pair of leather shoes that didn't have rubber soles. They were quiet, but they weren't Maid's shoes. A knock came at the door. It was Frank. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red from lack of sleep. The house was tense. Tess could hear the distant, muffled sounds of cars arriving and leaving, the heavy doors slamming below. The purge after Arthur's betrayal had clearly begun. The boss wants you downstairs, Frank said, not looking her in the eye. Don't keep him waiting. He's had a long morning. Tess dressed awkwardly with her left hand, the wool of the new dress scratching her collarbone. She felt like an imposter, a crow dressed in pigeon feathers. When she entered the library, The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the bitter aroma of black coffee. Thomas Dane sat behind his desk. The swelling on his jaw had settled into a deep, greenish-yellow bruise that made him look like a thug from a back alley despite his $3,000 suit. A stack of paper ledgers lay open before him, along with 3 separate telephones, none of which were ringing, but all of which looked dangerous. "Sit down," Thomas said, not looking up from a document. Tess sat in the leather chair opposite him, the same room where she had ruined his face 2 days prior. She kept her splinted hand in her lap. "Your mother lives in South Side," Thomas said, his voice flat as he turned a page. "A 3-room apartment over a bakery. She's behind on her medical bills for the arthritis. Your brother is 20, currently working the graveyard shift at the rail yard and looking for trouble he can't afford." Tess stiffened, her left hand gripping the armrest until her knuckles turned white. "They don't have anything to do with this. They don't even know where I work. I told them I clean an office building." "They don't have to do with this," Thomas agreed, finally looking up. His winter eyes were steady. "But they are your leverage. Everyone has leverage, Tess. Until today, your leverage was $80 a week and the fear of being evicted. Now, things are different." He slid a small piece of paper across the dark wood of the desk. Tess looked down. It was a check, drawn from a bank she had only ever seen from the outside. The number written on it made her stomach drop. It was more money than her father had earned in 5 years at the foundry before he died. "That clears your mother's debt," Thomas said, "and it pays the rent on a house in the suburbs for the next 3 years. A quiet place. No bakery below it. No damp." Tess didn't touch the paper. "What do I have to do for that?" "You're my personal assistant now," Thomas said. "Frank is a good driver, but he thinks with his teeth. The rest of the men in this house are looking for a way to take my seat or looking for a way to save their own skins if the ship goes down. You're the only person in this city who looked at me, saw a threat, and reacted without calculation. I told you I was scared." "Fear is honest," Thomas said, leaning back, his good shoulder dropping slightly. "I can work with fear. I can't work with ambition. Your job is simple. You stay within 5 feet of me when I'm in this house. You open my mail. You pour my tea. You look at the people who come into this room, and if you see something that looks like Arthur did, you tell me." "You want a bodyguard who doesn't know how to shoot?" Tess asked, her voice tinged with a cynical edge she couldn't suppress. "I have 50 men with guns outside that gate, Tess. None of them saw Arthur coming because they were looking at the fence. You were looking at the room." He stood up, walking around the desk. He stopped next to her chair, looking down at her. He reached out and touched the edge of her gray wool collar, his thumb brushing the rough fabric. "You're the new eyes of this house. Don't look at the floor anymore. Look at the people." Tess looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. The bruise on his jaw was a violent reminder of what she had done, but there was no anger in his face, only a strange, cold dependency that felt more terrifying than a pistol pointed at her head. "And if I say no," she asked, "if I take my broken fingers and go back to the South Side?" Thomas smiled, a tiny, humorless movement of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "You could, but the Marconi family knows Arthur is dead. They know someone in this house stopped him. By tomorrow morning, the whole city will know a maid broke Thomas Dane's jaw to save his life." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur. "You think they'll think you're just a maid, Tess? In my world, if you save the king, you become part of the court, like it or not." Tess looked at the check on the desk. She thought of her mother's swollen hands, the cold apartment where the gas was turned off every 3rd month, and the smell of industrial soap that she could still taste in the back of her throat. She reached out with her left hand and took the paper. "The tea," she said, her voice small but firm. "Do you take it with sugar?" Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of something old and dark passing through them. 2 cubes, no milk. And Tess? "Yes, Mr. Dane? Don't ever hit me again." "Then don't give me a reason to," she said, before she could stop herself. Thomas stared at her for a long, silent moment, then let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that seemed to surprise even him. Get to work, Tess. By December, the ache in Tess's hand only flared when it rained. A dull, pulsing throb in her right index and middle fingers. The heavy splint was gone, replaced by a subtle stiffness she had learned to hide. She had also learned to hide a lot of other things. The trembling in her knees when a heavy door slammed, the phantom smell of lemon bleach that sometimes hijacked her sinuses, and the profound, isolating realization that she could never go back to the basement apartment in South Side. Her mother thought she had been promoted to an executive secretarial position at a logistics firm. The newly paid-off medical bills and the quiet, draft-free house in the suburbs were proof enough for a woman too tired to ask dangerous questions. Tess stood in the corner of a closed-down seafood restaurant in the Harbor District. The air smelled of stale grease, old bay leaves, and the overwhelming synthetic scent of peppermint. The peppermint came from Leo Marcone. Leo sat across from Thomas at a square table covered in a cheap, red-checkered vinyl cloth. The Marcone boss was in his 60s, his skin the color and texture of a cured tobacco leaf, his breathing a wet, reedy wheeze that he tried to mask by constantly chewing peppermint lozenges. This was the peace talk, the parley to settle the blood spilled after Arthur's failed coup. Thomas sat perfectly still. He wore a heavy black overcoat, the collar turned up against the draft leaking through the restaurant's frosted windows. His jaw had healed. The yellow and green bruising faded back into the harsh, angular lines of his face. He didn't touch the small espresso cup sitting in front of him. Tess stood 3 feet behind Thomas's right shoulder. She wore her charcoal wool dress, her posture rigidly neutral. She wasn't carrying a weapon. Thomas had offered her a small, pearl-handled automatic 2 weeks ago. She had stared at it like it was a coiled snake and pushed it back across his desk. "I break bones when I panic," she had told him. "If I have a gun, I'll end up shooting the wrong person." He hadn't pushed the issue. "The docs are a mess, Tommy," Leo Marcone wheezed, crushing a peppermint between his molars. The crunch was loud in the empty dining room. "Arthur promised me unhindered transit for the winter shipments. You put him in the ground. And now my containers are sitting in customs, rotting." "Arthur sold you something he didn't own, Leo," Thomas replied. His voice was a low, even rumble, devoid of inflection. "You bought stolen goods. The risk is yours." "I bought a transition of power," Leo corrected, leaning forward, his heavily ringed fingers resting on the vinyl tablecloth. "A transition you rudely interrupted. And now I hear your dog is dead, your house is purged, and you've got a little maid standing behind you playing bodyguard." Leo's watery, yellowed eyes shifted to Tess. The look felt like a physical violation, a slimy drag of sandpaper against her skin. She didn't look down. She looked at his neck, right at the pulse point above his collar, exactly the way Thomas had taught her. "Look at the mechanics of the person, Tess, not the intimidation." "She's my assistant," Thomas said, not turning around. "And she's standing there because she has better eyes than anyone on your payroll." Tess kept her breathing shallow. She wasn't looking at Leo anymore. She was looking at the periphery. Frank was stationed by the front door, his hands in his pockets. 2 of Leo's men stood by the swinging kitchen doors. But it was the third man, a guy named Paulie from Thomas's own crew, who caught her attention. Paulie was standing near the coat rack to Leo's left. The restaurant was freezing, yet a bead of sweat was tracking slowly down the side of Paulie's face, catching the dim light of the overhead bulbs. Tess watched the drop of sweat. Paulie's eyes weren't on the boss's. His eyes were darting to the kitchen doors, then back to the floor. He swallowed hard. His right hand, shoved deep into his coat pocket, was twitching. It wasn't the natural shift of a man adjusting his weight. It was the tense, coiled micro-movement of someone preparing to draw iron. "Results are the only currency that matters." Thomas's words echoed in the back of her skull. Leo Marcone coughed, a rattling sound, and reached into his jacket pocket. "We need a new arrangement, Tommy, something that compensates me for the inconvenience." As Leo's hand went into his coat, ostensibly for another peppermint, Paulie's shoulder dropped an inch. The signal, Tess didn't think. The sheer animal instinct that had launched her across the parlor floor 2 months ago took over. But she wasn't a clumsy maid with a bucket anymore. She was the eyes of the house. She stepped forward, her movement sudden and sharp. She grabbed the heavy ceramic pot of scalding black coffee, sitting on the edge of the table intended for Leo's men, and didn't throw it at Leo. She hurled it sideways straight at Polly's chest. The heavy ceramic shattered against Polly's ribs with a violent crack. The scalding, muddy liquid exploded over his face and neck. Polly shrieked, a high, panic sound, his hands flying up to his blistered skin, entirely abandoning the snub-nosed revolver he was pulling from his coat. The gun clattered uselessly onto the linoleum floor. The room erupted. Frank had his weapon out before the coffee pot even hit the ground, aiming it squarely at the back of Leo Marcone's head. Leo's men scrambled, but Thomas was already moving. He didn't draw a gun. He lunged across the small table, his massive hand shooting out to grab Leo by the throat, pinning the older man against the high back of the wooden booth. Silence slammed back into the room, deafening and heavy, broken only by Polly's wet, agonized whimpering on the floor. Tess stood frozen, her chest heaving, the knuckles of her right hand burning fiercely. She looked at the spilled coffee, the shards of ceramic, the gun on the floor. She had done it again. Thomas held Leo pinned, his thumb pressing dangerously hard into the older man's windpipe. Thomas didn't look at the boss he was choking. He turned his head slowly, his winter sky eyes locking onto Polly, who was writhing on the floor, his face red and blistering. "A secondary play, Leo?" Thomas whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying contained fury. "You bought Arthur, and when that failed, you bought Polly to shoot me in the back during a parlay?" Leo gagged, his hands weakly clawing at Thomas's iron grip. "I didn't." "Save it," Thomas spat. He released Leo, letting the old man collapse, coughing against the table. Thomas straightened his coat, stepped over the spilled coffee, and looked at Frank. "Clean up the mess. Put Polly in the trunk. We'll talk to him at the warehouse." Thomas turned to Tess. His eyes scanned her face, looking for the panic, the tears, the breaking point. She gave him none of it. She shoved her trembling hands deep into the pockets of her wool dress and locked her jaw. "Are we leaving?" she asked, her voice sounding entirely unlike her own. It was flat, cold, and hollow. Thomas stared at her for a long second. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a grim acknowledgement. "Yeah, Tess, we're leaving." The library in the Dane estate was suffocatingly warm. The fireplace was roaring, consuming thick logs of cedar that popped and hissed, masking the silence between the two people in the room. It was 3 a.m. Tess sat in the leather armchair. She had kicked off her stiff shoes, her stockinged feet tucked under her. She felt hollowed out, a dry husk of a person. She had spent the last 5 hours staring at the wall in her suite while Thomas and Frank went to the warehouse. She didn't ask what happened to Polly. She didn't need to. The heavy metallic smell of copper and cold dirt clung to Thomas's coat when he finally returned. He didn't sit behind his desk. He walked over to the mahogany side table, the heavy crystal decanter clinking against 2 glasses. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into each, walked over, and handed one to Tess. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was freezing. Thomas sank heavily into the sofa opposite her, resting his elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. He looked exhausted. The invulnerable facade he wore for the men, for the Marcones, for the city, was stripped away, leaving a tired, aging man who lived his life waiting for the next bullet. He was going to do it when Leo reached for his mints, Thomas said quietly to the flames. That was the tell. Polly confessed before. He stopped, taking a slow sip of the whiskey. Before the end, Tess stared at her glass. The alcohol burned her nose. "I hate this." "I know," Thomas said. "I hate the noise. I hate the smell of this house. I hate that I look at people and wonder how much it costs to make them betray you." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed, angry tears. "I was a maid, Thomas. I cleaned dirt. Now I'm just rolling in it." It was the first time she had used his first name. Thomas didn't flinch. He set his glass down on the coffee table and leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. The intensity in his eyes was heavier than any physical threat. "You think poverty is clean, Tess?" he asked, his voice low, a gravelly rasp in the quiet room. "You think scrubbing floors for people who don't even see you is a pure life? Your mother is warm tonight. Your brother got a union job on the docks yesterday because I made one phone call. You aren't rolling in dirt, you're holding the shovel." "At what cost?" she whispered, a tear finally breaking free, cutting a hot track down her cheek. "I burned a man's face off today, without even thinking. I didn't feel bad. I just felt relieved that it wasn't you." The admission hung in the air, naked and vulnerable. Thomas exhaled slowly. He stood up, closing the distance between them. He knelt on the Persian rug in front of her chair. He was a man who bowed to no one, a man who broke empires and buried traitors, kneeling on the floor in front of a girl from the South Side. He reached out and gently took her right hand. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her knuckles. The skin was slightly thicker there now, the bones healed but permanently altered by the violence of their first meeting. He ran his thumb over the joint of her index finger. "The cost is that you can never close your eyes again," Thomas said softly. "The cost is that you belong to this world now. But you don't belong to Leo Marconi. You don't belong to the men in the cars." He looked up, his winter sky eyes softening, revealing a devastating, quiet loneliness that mirrored her own. "You belong with me, because you're the only one who sees the room." Tess looked down at his large, scarred hands holding hers. She felt the warmth of his skin, the rough calluses, the terrifying safety of his grip. She realized with a sickening, profound clarity that she didn't want him to let go. The lemon bleach, the damp basement, the innocent exhaustion, it was all gone, burned away by gunpowder and peppermint. She wasn't a good person anymore. But as she tightened her grip on Thomas Dane's hand, feeling the steady, heavy beat of his pulse against her bruised knuckles, she knew she wasn't a victim either. She was exactly where she chose to be. In the dark, standing next to the monster, watching the door. Tess took a slow breath, the scent of cedar smoke and expensive whiskey filling her lungs. She pulled her hand back, just enough to pick up her glass, and raised it slightly. "Then don't miss," she said, her voice steadying, the last trace of the terrified maid vanishing into the embers. "'Cause I'm not throwing coffee next time." Thomas's lips curved into a true, genuine smile, a rare, dangerous expression that transformed his rugged face. He picked up his own glass, tapping it gently against hers. "Deal," he whispered. If you loved this raw, intense mafia romance, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a badass heroine who takes matters into her own hands. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping, emotional stories just like this one. Drop a comment below. Would you have punched the boss to save his life or run for the door? Let us know and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.